Welcome to the Really Know Your Customer podcast with your hosts, Betsy Westhafer and Tony Bodoh. Join Betsy and Tony as they dive in with highly successful C-suite leaders who have grown successful organizations by creating a laser focus on listening to their customers and building deep customer relationships. Now, it's time to join Betsy and Tony for the Really Know Your Customer show.
Hi, and welcome to the Really Know Your Customer podcast. I'm Tony Bodoh.
And I'm Betsy Westhafer. We're super glad you're here today.
Today, we've got Ross Fulton on the show with us, and I'm really excited about this because Ross is going to talk through his experience of helping companies move from like a permanent software solution to a subscription model. And I think it's so relevant today. In the tech world, people know about this concept, but if you just look back over the last 12 months or so, there's a couple interesting things I've seen in the subscription world. As an example, Panera now allows you to have a subscription to coffee of all things. And car companies are coming out with subscriptions. So we're going to see subscriptions coming out in a lot of different industries. So our focus today on the tech world will show where it's at, how far it's advanced, and probably give some ideas to our listeners, whether they're in tech or elsewhere, of how that might apply to their business.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this, Tony. Ross and I connected a couple of years ago, I think on LinkedIn. Can't really remember exactly how we connected, but we really jived on the customer stuff and his focus with being customer success and all things strategic around customers. So very much looking forward to this conversation and getting to know Ross a little bit better as well as the work he does. So Ross, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Betsy. It's an honor to be here. Happy to have the conversation today.
Yeah, so I'm sure that you have had the opportunity to be on podcasts before and talk about yourself. So why don't we kick it off with a little bit of your background, where you originated, where you landed now, your career path, and just a little bit about the work you're doing right now.
Yeah, thanks, Betsy, for having us and having me here today. It's an honor to be here. And a bit about myself. So I grew up in London, now live in Vancouver, BC, in beautiful Canada. And the informative years of my career were certainly spent in London before I left in 2008 with the big economic black cloud that was looming back then. My career has always been in B2B technology. And in a series of roles where I've had one foot in the sales side of the equation and one foot in the post-sales side of the equation, often in roles where I had foot in both camps at the same time. And so was really very much accountable for making sure that, sure, let's acquire business and acquire customers, but let's make sure we're acquiring customers that we can make successful and business that we can actually retain and grow. And that paradigm is now what my company Valuize that I founded and I'm now CEO of really focuses on. So we work with B2B software companies and help them retain and expand their customers and revenue, and we help them do that at scale. And that has really been a hell of a growth story for us over the last 2 to 3 years, because B2B software companies are now moving towards and have largely adopted in a lot of cases a revenue model that really points them to the need to keep customers and grow existing customers and shifts them away from just thinking about how do I acquire the next new customer. And that revenue model focused on a subscription or a consumption revenue model, some sort of recurring revenue model, is really what we specialize in at Valuize, and how you wrap a customer and lifecycle revenue strategy around those economics. And it's something that I happen to have spent most of my career doing pre the subscription economy, pre the adoption of this type of revenue model. I helped build out a pretty large gain share based technology revenue model based business in London. And that was all about we getting paid as the service provider through off the back of the value that we were delivering to the customer. So we had to make sure we were acquiring the right customer. We had to make sure we were able to deliver value to that customer, because that was simply how we got paid. There was no upfront payments. There was no sort of payment for access. It was payment for value. And it's that fundamental principle around having that shared value realization with the end customer that really is what we specialize in today as Valuize, and that we operationalize for our clients. And that really helps drive the valuation of our clients in their public and private markets.
So talk to us a little bit about how you work with these technology companies that have had this more traditional model to, permanent installations on premises, things like that, to a subscription or a value-based model that you're talking about. What does that conversion look like, and how do they move through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's obviously a lot of companies who have grown up in over the last 10 to 15, even longer, 20 to 25 years, who really had the informative years of their business model developed around the perpetual licensing model, i.e. I'm a customer and I'll buy a license to access the software, and that license gives me access forever. I might pay additional uplifts around accessing new versions. I might pay for maintenance, but really the upfront payment is all is my major expenditure. That is now transformed to more the subscription economy, where I'm going to pay a certain amount a month or a year to access the software, and I'm going to keep paying that for as long as I want to access that software. So what that means for the vendor is that they need to ensure that there is a reason for that customer to want to renew their subscription, as well as obviously hopefully expand that subscription. And that reason has to be value. It has to be, am I achieving what we at Valuize call value-based outcomes? Am I achieving outcomes that create measurable recurring value for me through my usage of this software application? Because if I am, I'm very likely to renew, and I'm very likely to potentially expand my investment to enable more value to be accessed either by other people in my company or maybe new outcomes to be realized. That as a concept around, I need to retain and expand my customers, as importantly, arguably more importantly, certainly for establishing enterprise companies than acquiring net new customers. That, first of all, is a very strong paradigm shift for B2B technology companies who, in the perpetual revenue model world, were in the traditional model that I grew up in, and that I think a lot of us still can look back on and remember very clearly, which is acquire the customer, acquire the customer, acquire the customer. And so that's given born to this domain of customer success inside a number of verticals now, but especially inside B2B technology. This domain, associated organizations called customer success, an associated technology category called customer success technology, which is all pointed at how do we drive that value realization? How do we drive the outcomes within our existing customers so we can retain and expand them? And so not only is there a very significant economic shift in terms of the unit economic metrics that B2B software companies need to be tracking and prioritizing, which we can talk for a long time about, but there's also a fundamental shift in how companies need to invest and strategize around their acquisition and their post-sales, or their sales and their post-sales strategies. A lot of companies now will talk in this dialect of customer acquisition, then customer adoption, customer expansion, customer retention, and look at the customer life cycle in those four phases. We certainly see adoption, expansion, retention as a cycle. It's hopefully never ending to optimize that lifetime value. Adoption is a never ending concept. But these represent new concepts. They represent new ways of structuring an organization, incentivizing an organization. They represent new ways of executing processes with customers and internally. And there are a number of companies that are doing incredibly well at it, and their metrics around their retention rates of customers, their retention of revenue, what is known as net revenue retention, which is how much revenue am I retaining and how much revenue am I expanding within my customer base, and combining those two metrics together. There's some incredible companies out there doing some incredible stuff in that regard, and their company valuations, whether they be private or public, really reflect that. But there's a lot of companies out there that are still just going through this transition process. There's a number of older enterprise companies out there that are still moving from perpetual revenue to subscription revenue. And so the consequential shift in how they're getting to work with their customers, how they're managing their customers, how they're acquiring their customers is in this kind of quasi-transition flux, where they're still maybe selling in the traditional way, but they're trying to make the customers successful post-sale. But because they're really just on a mission of let's acquire any customer that will buy, that makes consistently and scalably making customers successful on the back end quite a challenge. So it's a real mixed bag in the B2B software industry right now, but there's certainly a trend and there's certainly a pendulum shift towards subscription, towards the retention and expansion of customers. That pendulum shift is being driven by both private investors as well as the public markets, who recognize how subscription revenue models now work and the importance of retention and expansion of customers. And so they're putting the pressure on the leaders of these companies. The boards are putting pressure on the leaders of these companies to answer the question as to, how are you going to keep this customer? How are you going to grow them? And how are you going to give me that lifetime value back that is ultimately going to give me a return on my investment?
I think that's so interesting to think about. It's not just at the tactical level, but all the way up to the investors who are watching for this kind of thing. So I'd really appreciate it, Ross, if you could talk to us a little bit just about this whole quote unquote customer success train that has left the station. I know in talking with lots of people, some people love the term, some people don't love the term, but can you kind of talk us through what that really means and how it's different than customer experience or customer engagement, or, just kind of what this whole customer success entity is?
Yeah, absolutely. And from my, I guess if I talk to my personal opinion, customer success, customer experience, customer engagement, they really need to be blended into one concept. I think, as with a lot of industry terms, a number of them are born out of market creation activities by people trying to sell into a market. So customer success being a term that really has been standardized and pushed by customer success technology vendors looking to create this market category that they can go sell in and say, hey, you need CS technology versus you need CX technology. So I would say that, but certainly customer success is pointed at, how do we drive adoption within my customer base? How do I get them to be using my solutions in a way that, again, creates success, creates value, so I can then retain and expand the customers? That's what customer success really fundamentally is all about. And customer experience as a comparable and parallel field is instrumental in that goal of ensuring that customers are using the software in such a way that they're realizing value. Customer experience is arguably more sentiment based in terms of, how do I feel when I'm using the application? How do I feel about my experience of actually being a customer of this vendor? Customer success is arguably a bit more outcome function, almost functional, in terms of, how do I actually, doing the job I do as a customer, as a user within this customer, the job that I perform, how do I integrate that with the capabilities of this particular software application and use it in such a way that I'm going to create some value? I'm going to make myself more effective, more efficient. I'm going to de-risk what I'm doing, whatever the set of outcomes may be. That's what customer success is pointed at. And CX is, again, a very complementary field to that. I do believe that a lot of organizations get themselves lost in, okay, should we be doing CX or CS, or should I have a voice of the customer program, or should I have a customer advocacy program? They're all the same thing. At the end of the day, they're all about ensuring that customers are realizing value, that they're realizing value through an experience that is palatable and acceptable and hopefully enjoyable to them. And all that combines to allowing that B2B software company to keep that customer and grow them. But that's maybe some of the distinctions that I'd call out, but they're increasingly getting blended. Customer success is certainly now increasingly, and rightly so, focused on automation. How do we automate the motion of customer success? How do we use technology to engage with the customer in the application or through some sort of technology-driven touch to give the customer that input that they need to allow them to get to that piece of value, to allow them to adopt that part of my product. And so as we develop that technology type of touch, the ability to drive a positive experience inside the design of that touch is incredibly important, because we're no longer able just to rely, or we're not relying anymore on a human customer success manager spending an hour conveying that point. It's one email or it's one pop-up in the application. And so the CX side of that type of touch is incredibly important, because you've kind of got one shot. So yeah, they're getting increasingly blended in the same way that customer success and sales is getting increasingly blended as a strategy, as a motion, in some cases as an organization. So it's interesting to watch.
Yeah, it's interesting because Betsy and I, we talk a lot about customer experience and customer transformation. And having worked in the tech side, but also worked in financial services and hospitality and all these others that Betsy and I both kind of crossed over, you can't use the same terminology and get to the same end sometimes. Yep. And so one of the areas, like when we talk about customer success in the tech field, I talk about that in the hospitality world is like customer transformation, right? It's how do you help the customer achieve their goal? I think that's fundamentally it. And to do that, as you said, you've got to create an experience that's positive, rewarding, et cetera. And so it's interesting to hear all these different terminologies. Maybe someone will invent the term finally. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I mean, and it's interesting. Sales never really went through it as a domain. It's always been sales. I mean, a lot of companies now maybe talk about customer acquisition. Some will be talking about their land strategy. But sales has really reigned supreme with this concept of the post-sales customer experience and success and what have you. Yeah, there's a whole glossary out there, and I don't think it really adds too much value, and is a market creation, market segmentation exercise gone wild. But it is what it is.
So Ross, in the work that you do, you're working at a high level, strategic level, looking at the whole big picture for this world of creating value. And what are some of the biggest challenges that you run into as you start your engagements with your clients?
I think one of the big ones, and I mean, Valuize was named for a reason. It's my silly play on value realization. And one of the biggest challenges we see is all the way up to the biggest technology companies in the world that we work with and talk to is there a consistent, well understood definition of what value is available to be realized through usage of the product or platform or products that software vendor is providing. And by value, I'm meaning not just the big sort of headline value proposition of we'll save you money or we'll make you more money or we'll de-risk, but what are the actual outcomes that we can measure that the vendor can be truly accountable for that are achieved through usage of the product that contribute to achieving that big value proposition. That definition of those outcomes is surprisingly rare and lacking. And without those outcomes, and certainly the Valuize framework that we've developed, if you haven't got those outcomes defined around this is how a customer is going to measure the value of using our particular product, and this is this kind of sequence of these outcomes, how on earth do you develop the processes and the playbooks and the reporting and the leading indicators, the lagging indicators that you want to be able to measure the health and success of your customers if you don't know what the outcomes are to begin with? A lot of companies are resorting to more of any usage is good. As long as someone is doing something inside the software application, then that has to be a good thing. And I'm going to assume that they're successful in moving towards the big, hairy value proposition. That really doesn't cut it anymore. And a lot of data inside companies that relate to their loss of customers, what's known as churn data, clearly highlights that any usage is not necessarily good usage. The usage has to be pointed at making sure the right job is doing the right thing and the right application to move towards achieving outcomes. That's the usage we want to be seeing and that we want to be looking for indicators of. So I'd say defining those outcomes is a big one, and that's quite a vulnerable experience and a vulnerable conversation for people to have with my team when we're going into maybe founders, leaders of some pretty significant software companies and asking the question to say, can you explain to me what the measurable value of using your product is? And we get a few blank stares every now and then because they can say, well, this is the big goal that the customer's shooting for in terms of using our product, but exactly how our product contributes to that in a measurable way, we haven't really got well articulated. So that's an interesting one. I think another big one is reconciling this motion and these two, ultimately their cultures of sales and post-sales, customer success, whatever you would like to call it. And having the organization culturally, as well as strategically, as well as operationally, realize that what happens in the acquisition process, in the sales process, has a huge impact on the company's ability to then keep the customer and expand the customer and ultimately make the customer successful. And so there is what I would describe it as a revolution happening in terms of how that sales motion is getting integrated into the post-sales motion and vice versa, to ensure that there is alignment, there is unification, and that the right customers are being acquired, so they can then, and by right customer, I mean customers that the vendor can look at a profile level and say, yes, we can make you successful. You fit the profile that we know we can drive adoption within using our product and get you to value, and therefore keep you and achieve our lifetime value goals as a business. And it's incredible to watch. And there's some interesting technology coming out that's helping facilitate this integration. But there's a long way to go in a lot of companies. I've talked a lot about this concept of accidents happen at intersections, and in the customer life cycle, there is one intersection that is the most dangerous for any business, and it's that intersection between acquiring that customer and transitioning them into post-sale as a customer into onboarding, which is a term a lot of companies will use. That intersection is historically, and still in many companies, is lethal, because either companies get dropped into a black hole and get forgotten about. Best case, in a lot of companies, the customer crosses that intersection and they're greeted with a team and a set of operations and processes that treat the customer like they've never been seen before. And all the IP, all the conversations that have been had around the customer's current state and the outcomes that they want to be achieving through the technology, it all gets lost. And they've just spent 6 months buying this software, and now they're talking to a new team, and the first thing the new team says to them is, "Oh, so what do you want to do with the software?" It's not a good look, but it's certainly a complex and deep set of changes to make inside a B2B software company to minimize the risk of that intersection and actually pave over it and just create a nice seamless bridge. But I'd say that is probably the other big challenge that I see as being front of mind for a lot of B2B software companies.
It's interesting because I'm hearing you talk about how fundamentally the name of our show here is the Really Know Your Customer podcast. Mm-hmm. And you know what your customers need to do. You know that very well. You've got the whole methodology built out there. And then you look at your customers, it's like, okay, do you know your outcomes? And those outcomes are not what they want to achieve, it's what their customers want to achieve, right? And then even further, as you just described here, between that sales and that, post-sales process, if there's no transfer of knowledge, there's a whole element of not knowing your customer there. Yeah, you do know them, but you never transfer that knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really fascinating to start to think about this lack of communication. That's a key element. So how do you bridge that gap with the clients you're working with, or what have you seen as a successful approach to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And you hit an interesting point around, yes, the outcomes certainly shouldn't be focused on what the vendor wants, and that, yes, I want to keep you, I want to grow you. That's all that matters. That's a lagging way of looking at things. The retention and expansion is a product as a result of achieving the customer outcomes. But certainly what we prescribe, and a bit of a pun there, which you'll discover in a second, what we prescribe as Valuize is a prescriptive approach to this outcome-based mentality, i.e. not going into every single sales cycle with a new customer with a blank sheet of paper and say, well, what do you want to achieve? Instead, taking far more of a doctor-patient type of approach and saying, hey, we as the vendor, we are experts in your type of company. We understand your market, your industry, your vertical, your current state, et cetera, et cetera. We also understand the strategic goals you want to get to, what we might have, what the equivalent of the vendor's value proposition on the website is, that big strategic goal. Let us prescribe to you the outcomes you have to achieve to be able to get to that big strategic goal. In the same way that a doctor would prescribe a solution, a plan of action to a patient. Again, similarly, the doctor is always going to recognize that there's a number of variables that each patient has in terms of their current state, genetics, weight, whatever it may be. The same goes in B2B software in terms of if I'm selling a sales productivity solution to a certain size of company in a certain vertical, there's going to be a lot of common DNA there, but there's going to be a number of variables. And so I still need to have that very consultative discovery qualification mindset inside the sales process to make sure that I'm prescribing the right outcomes in the right sequence, but it's still a prescriptive approach. And that prescriptive approach, we encourage very, very heavily. We've written a lot about, because it allows the vendor to standardize post-sale. Because if we've got confidence that the sales organization is prescribing from the same repository of outcomes each time to the customers, and that we're only going to be acquiring, hopefully, customers who are signing up to achieve outcomes out of that prescriptive repository, post-sales, I can be building the processes, the playbooks, the formulas that achieve those outcomes in my technology and have those ready to go. So we create not only prescriptive outcomes, we create prescriptive formulas or prescriptive approaches to achieving those outcomes that we can also communicate pre-sales or during the sales cycle, but also we've got ready to go day one as soon as we execute the customer. So the customer comes through, we've got a success plan with that customer. They've said, yes, I want to achieve outcomes A, B, C, and D in that sequence. As a CS organization or a professional services organization, whoever owns onboarding, they can see, okay, we're starting with that outcome that triggers this prescriptive set of processes and playbooks. Let's go to work, as opposed to going in with yet another blank sheet of paper and trying to reinvent the wheel inside each customer life cycle or customer's life cycle. So that prescriptive approach, and applying it pre-sale, but making sure that it's really driven from the design post-sale of how are we going to get customers successful, is extremely powerful. And we've worked with some companies who have achieved incredible results in applying that approach. And we're working with a number of organizations who are now starting to develop their own version and put it into their own revenue and customer lifecycle model. There's a whole list of operational and system and process and organizational based concepts that we would also put in to streamline the communication, as you described, Tony. But again, all roads lead to the outcomes, all roads lead to the definition of the outcomes, and all roads lead to those definitions being prescriptive, because that's how we can unify that customer lifecycle.
You know, I think so many people really appreciate that prescriptive approach. Like, the less you have to make them think and they have this friction in their brain, the more value you're giving them. And so I think that's a brilliant approach. One thing I wanted to touch on, Ross, is, you know, we talked about there are opportunities for automation, but you and I have had conversations about the personal relationships and those kinds of things. And we talked about where a customer advisory board would fit into the overall strategy. So I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit on customer advisory boards and where this fits into everything that you just described.
Customer advisory boards, I'll call them CABs, just to keep things succinct, are so important. I think we go back again to the concept of outcomes and designing these outcomes and designing them in such a way that they're going to be received as powerful prescriptions in the way that you described, Betsy. The critical input into that design process is understanding the customer, knowing the customer. And customer advisory boards as a platform for a company and in the leadership of a company to get very, very deep into understanding their customers, the leaders of their customers, the key stakeholders in their customers is the most powerful platform I know to be able to do that. It plays to the whole Steve Blank methodology of get out of the building. If you want to understand your customers, you've got to get out of the building. It goes all the way through to the origins of any software company in terms of trying to achieve that first version of product market fit. You have to know your customers to achieve that. It's the same with developing these outcomes. You have to be able to know your customers to develop these outcomes. And the joy of the customer advisory board is that it's not a one-time conversation. It is a recurring event where you're meeting with this very powerful set of minds who are going to give you incredible insight into your business. You're meeting with them on a quarterly basis, typically. And that's so important because, I mean, it's May 2020, and obviously times have never been in such flux. But even in more normal times, things are constantly iterating and changing inside the customers' businesses, in the markets that they operate, in the geographies that they operate. And so as a B2B software vendor, we need to be constantly iterating on the design of our outcomes and the design of our customer success strategies to reflect changes that are happening in our customers' world, as well as changes that we're proactively driving through innovations in our own technology. So again, customer advisory boards give me that, or give my clients that finger on the pulse within their customer base to say, in Q2 of this year, this was front of mind. This is what's keeping them up at night. And so therefore I can pivot or adapt or evolve my strategies internally to address those priorities, versus in Q3, the landscape shifted a bit. That is no longer the priority. This is now the priority. Or actually, no, you know what? That priority has now been doubled down on. It is all that matters right now. So I need to double down on my ability to ensure that my customers can use my software to achieve that one outcome out of the 10 that I've got built out, because that outcome is all that matters. And if I can identify that, my sales leader is going to love me as well, because that one outcome is what I give to my sales leader and say, hey, go to market, and my marketing leader, go to market and prescribe this and explain how we deliver this, because this is what our target market, this is what our ideal customer profile is looking for. And I think that ideal customer profile concept is a good way of sort of summarizing a lot of this in terms of a customer advisory board enables me to build and then consistently ensure that my ideal customer profile that should be applied as a governance mechanism across my customer lifecycle, sales, marketing, customer success, professional services, that profile is up to date and accurate. That's what a CAB gives me. And the ROI that's then driven from that in terms of retention, expansion, as well as net new sales speaks for itself.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts on that, Ross. One thing that I just kind of want to follow up on that is just the risk of assuming you know what those key metrics are and what value looks like to one customer may be totally different than what it looks like for another one. And I just had that experience myself. We have some key metrics that we use, and I put them out to a client recently and just said, hey, I just want to do a pulse check on where you are on these metrics. And even within that customer, they had shifted. And it may be completely different than what matters to another customer and to their boards and to their investors. So there are a lot of people weighing in on what value means to them. So really appreciate your thoughts on that, Ross.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And it is a balance. And I certainly see organizations talk to leaders in organizations who are drifting too far down. Well, my usage data, my telemetry data from inside my software application, my mass kind of user sentiment data, et cetera, tells me what I need. And that more qualitative individual conversation with a key stakeholder inside my ideal customer profile. Oh, why would I do that when I have 10,000, 100,000, a million other data points over here? It's got to be a blend of both for exactly the reason you describe, Betsy. And it's easy to get lost into, I can get all these different types of data now and do all these cool advanced analytics on usage data and support ticket data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to give me these insights. And you should be doing that. And it is very powerful, but it doesn't replace the need for the type of insight that a customer advisory board gives you.
I kind of want to follow up on that. It seems to me that there's a lot of companies that they start out, they have an idea of what that outcome is, right? And they start inventing and innovating their software. And then somewhere in the middle, it's like after they get to market with that first or second version of it, they kind of disconnect from the customer. And then it's only like when they realize, hey, we've got to grow, we can't grow beyond where we are today, that they'll re-engage someone like yourself or someone like Betsy or me and say, we got to get back in front of the customer again. And so what is it in your mind, or what have you seen out there is that trigger point that causes them to move away from the customer and that trigger point that moves them back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I think it speaks to what is still relevant, but certainly is maybe a bit too linear and too simplistic, at least for today's market, which is we must establish product market fit as a B2B software company. Once we have that product market fit, or we believe we have that product market fit, data is telling us we have product market fit, we scale. And that scale mentality and that scale pressure is absolutely driven from investors in most cases, And why wouldn't you? If you've got a formula that suddenly started working, why wouldn't you double down on that? But it is a dangerous mindset to make, especially as recent events have shown. You've got to be able to pivot. You've got to be flexible, and you've got to make sure, to the point around customer advisory boards, that you're always understanding how the market, how the customers are evolving around value, their perception of value. Value is in the eye of the beholder, not the seller. And so if the customer's definition and need around value is changing, you've instantly lost a degree, if not possibly entirely, all your product market fit. So scaling no longer makes sense. And so we talk a lot about sustainable growth in Valuize, and yes, scale, please scale, but let's do it sustainably. And the key to sustainable growth in B2B software in this subscription economy is ensuring that we're growing with a recognition that it's got to be driven through retention and expansion as much as acquisition. And so are we still retaining and expanding our customers while we're scaling the acquisition? Are we seeing the leading indicators of customer health and customer adoption and customer success, which ultimately are the leading indicators for retention and expansion? Are they looking good while we're scaling acquisition? Because the moment that those start to tweak, all you're doing is compounding the problem by acquiring the same customers with the same expectations when you're losing customers at the bottom end of your funnel. And so in terms of triggers, it is that data, is those metrics that now, I'd say only in the last year, really, I would say become extremely mainstream in boardrooms, which is talk to me about your retention of your customers. Talk to me about that at a logo level. How many logos are you retaining month to month, year to year, as well as how much revenue within your customer base are you retaining? Talk to me about the expansion of that customer base, and talk to me about net revenue retention, because they're now being viewed as critical as your acquisition metrics around traditional sales metrics, as well as things like customer acquisition cost and what have you, CAC payback periods. And the moment that those retention metrics and expansion metrics start to look questionable, the red flag goes up, and the question mark around product market fit and are we scaling in the right direction start to get asked, and the pivots start to happen. Where the very successful companies get it right is that they're not waiting for their retention metrics to look bad before they make that pivot, before they take the foot off the scaling gas and make a change. They're looking at the leading indicators, their adoption and success. They're looking at how they can assess and monitor customer health. They're listening to their customers and their customer advisory boards, and seeing the leading indicators that are going to drive challenges around retention, and then pivoting, and then realizing, okay, are we shooting for the right outcomes here? Do we need to evolve our technology stack in some way? Are we actually starting to acquire the wrong customer because we're so focused on scaling through acquisition that we were acquiring the right customer, which was giving us that product market fit, but now we're straying into the wrong segments, where we're going up market too fast, or we've crossed into another industry or another vertical that just doesn't align with the outcomes that we can deliver as a software solution provider. The earlier we ask those questions, obviously the better, but the continuous nature of asking those questions is really the critical piece. But yeah, I've done the early stage rocket ship before, and yeah, you get caught up in it, and it's like, my God, we're Midas, we can't lose here. Let's just keep acquiring as many people as we can. But thankfully, we also had the mindset to look at the bottom half of the funnel, the second funnel, where our existing customers sat, and made sure that was a finely tuned engine that was then getting reflected in the acquisition motion that we were trying to scale.
I think that points to also the whole concept of the alignment of the leadership team, because everybody has their own goggles on that they're looking at their part of the business through. And so, if you're in sales, you're looking at acquisition, right? And if you're and we talk about this in the book too, you have your kings, priests, and prophets, just looking in the book Profitability that Tony and I wrote. You have these different perspectives. And if the leadership team is not coming together, and that's one of the things we do within our customer advisory board methodology, is making sure that we have the internal alignment before they go in front of their key customers. But I would imagine that really plays into the work that you do as well, because you've got to bring together all these different perspectives to make sure that the retention and expansion the people that are focused on that and focus, the people that are focused on the other part, that they're all coming together so that there is that dual view at what's going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it's critical. I mean, the degree of change that I was describing earlier in the conversation that B2B software companies are going through because of the changes in the revenue model and so on, it has to be top down. This is not a kind of user or individual employee driven concept. It has to be a top down sponsored change. And so you've got to have that unification in the leadership team. I think there's some interesting trends around the emergence of the chief revenue officer or chief customer officer type of role that are increasingly getting that holistic ownership of the entire revenue and customer life cycle. So they're not just incentivized around bringing new customers in the door, but they're also incentivized and accountable for keeping those customers and growing those customers. I think that's a very, very healthy approach to take at a leadership level, and it's an instant red flag to myself and my team when we look at a company that clearly has God forbid a silo, but even any form of misalignment between the sales and post-sales leader, if they are two separate roles, and if they roll up into a COO or CEO who is at best ignorant of the risk, or maybe worst case apathetic to the risk of that misalignment and those silos, and instantly we have to fix that first before we do anything else. But I think, a lot of companies are now trending to that holistic ownership of the revenue lifecycle. The product side of the equation, I think, I would say a year ago, it was equally kind of concerning in terms of the silos between the sales and maybe post-sales leadership, and then post-sales leadership and product. The sales to CS piece, the sales to post-sales piece is getting a lot better. I still think a lot of organizations struggle with integration with the product organization and the product leadership, and the communication flows are better, at least certainly the quality of data flowing from the customer-facing teams like customer success into product, and say, hey, here's what we're hearing, here's what we're seeing, here's what our data tells us around how our customers are adopting our product and what they want to be using the product for and how they want to use the product. That data is much of a much higher quality going into the product organizations. It's debatable how often the product organization truly takes it on board and integrates it sufficiently into their product roadmap strategy, product design strategy, and ultimately takes it seriously. If they have a product roadmap that's already baked and they've got next quarter planned out, they've got the next year planned out, a lot of them are loath to change it. But to your point, Betsy, and what we've been talking about around the rate of iteration and change in markets and how we need to keep on top of those, to ensure customers stay successful, that iteration has to be applied to how we stay on top of the product roadmap. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of companies that do it well. But that alignment at the leadership level between product and customer-facing teams, let's call it customer success, is I think still very much work in progress. And then the other root cause that we often see, that we see it in all sizes of companies, but I say is more prevalent, maybe more in the growth stage size of company, mid-market size of company, is the leadership's understanding of the revenue model they're operating in now. Even if they are the sort of the 25, 30 something young genius who's developed this potential unicorn of a company, they're still often being mentored and maybe are hiring additional leadership members around them that come from this old world of perpetual revenue. And maybe they have worked in SaaS companies and subscription revenue companies before, prior to joining this new company, but they haven't quite got their head around the unit economics of a recurring revenue model and what net revenue retention really means, and let alone how the strategies need to be built to optimize net revenue retention. So that new leader inherits some of that mindset, and it becomes, again, all about acquisition and just a kind of a prey approach to retention. So understanding once you get into a room and you explain to them the unit economics and how it all maps to how they acquire customers and how they drive adoption, etc., light bulbs go off. There's a lot of often wide-eyed panic expressions in the room, but they at least have the clarity, and then we've got alignment and buy-in to the changes that need to get made. Where it gets super tricky is many companies have a hybrid revenue model still. They're transitioning from perpetual to subscription. You've got people incentivized still on the perpetual model, but also the subscription model. Where do you go? That's a tricky one, but it's kind of unavoidable. You can't flick a switch and turn a company overnight from perpetual to subscription. It is a transition process, but that's certainly a sticky patch to get through.
I want to take us back a few minutes here. You said a term that I don't hear spoken often enough. You said that there are people that could be wrong customers. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we talk about that enough. And how do you make sure you're focused on the right customer? Honestly, to me, it seems like it would make sense, especially going to this customer success world, that we would actually measure and track how many wrong customers have we had conversations with, how far did they get down our pipeline. And I say that because if I think that can be a leading indicator also that you may have to change your platform. Either you're selling to the wrong people, your marketing is wrong, or you've got to change your platform, and they might be the key indicator. So it's just funny that you said, because I can count on my hand how many people I've talked to over the course of my career and have ever admitted the heresy of wrong customer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's again, it gets to it's extreme. I mean, thousands of years around, customers are about me selling. I mean, when I talk about customers, I'm thinking about acquiring a new customer. And so when you talk about the ideal customer profile, there's a lot of people that understandably naturally just think, well, an ideal customer is one who's most likely to buy from me. I'm not naturally thinking in a lot of people's cases, an ideal customer is sure someone who's going to buy from me, but someone I can make successful, someone I can keep as a customer and grow. I'm not saying people are exclusively not thinking about the retention and growth piece at all. But it's often a side note at best. With the recurring revenue type of model, you can't afford to have that mentality. The ideal customer profile must be centered on who can I make successful so I can therefore retain and expand them. That is who I then go and acquire. Yes, there's some specifics around their ability to buy from me, and that's, you should always have an ideal buyer profile, but the ideal buyer profile is a subset of the ideal customer profile. And from a sales governance perspective, in terms of me being a vice president of sales and looking at my pipeline for the next 2 quarters out, I've got to be looking at my prospects and the opportunities and assessing them against the ideal customer profile, not just the ideal buyer profile. However, a lot of VP sales aren't incentivized to think that way, let alone their sales reps underneath them. They're only incentivized to get a customer in the door. And so why would I be thinking about the more holistic ideal customer profile? That's an area that every company needs to look at and make sure is addressed. And it, again, increasingly is being addressed. So you see mechanisms like clawbacks being put into commission plans, where if a customer, as a sales rep, if I acquire this customer, if that customer churns in X period of time later, my commission or percentage of my commission gets clawed back. I've seen that's the stick approach. We see the carrot approach as well, which I would always start with the recommendation around, which is incentivize the sales rep to acquire the right customer, instead of threatening them with a stick, where you have a more of a hybrid sales role, where that sales rep is not only acquiring but also farming, so expanding existing customers. There's a very logical conversation to have with them to say, hey, you want to acquire the right customer because that gives you the opportunity to expand over here. Where you've got the hunter-farmer model, where you just have hunters, and then you have farmers who are a separate sales team who are doing the expansion piece, or maybe customer success is doing the expansion piece, which I would fully endorse. There you've just got to go with governance primarily on that hunting team and say, yeah, we're going to govern you and we're going to require you to acquire the right customers, not just any customers. But again, someone's there with a pen ready to sign the PO. It's in the moment, it can be hard to do. So I have huge empathy, but it has to be done to get these revenue models to work.
You know, it's just so funny to think we all probably in a freshman level college course learned about how much cheaper it is to retain a client than it is to acquire one. It's such easy math. And so it's really kind of striking to me that it's such a topic of conversation about how important it is. So just a little observation there.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's very true. And I think the theory is fairly well universally understood. The ability to measure it and report on it at a company per company perspective, a lot of companies just don't. Many companies I've seen don't have the systems and the operations to be able to report on. They're doing maybe an okay job of reporting on cost of customer acquisition, but they should be reporting on cost of customer retention and cost of customer expansion, but they're not. And so they don't have their own company specific version of that theory to prove out and say to their board or say to their leadership, we should be doubling down over here. It's still rooted in more sort of macro theories, which are correct, but it's not quite enough to drive that change in a lot of companies.
If you look at the cost of churn compared to all of those costs, I mean, it's just kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Hey, switching gears for a minute, Ross, Tony and I really love to, on this show, give our guests an opportunity to give a shout out to a community organization or a charitable organization, or just somebody that you want to kind of shine a spotlight on. Is there any organization that you'd like to share a little bit about with our audience?
Yeah, I think there is a local. I live in a small town south of Vancouver, and there's a small organization that really doubles down on helping young children with educational opportunities and getting into a lot of STEM thinking. So a lot of science, technology type of thinking, solving creative problems that I think is incredibly important. There's a lot of worthy causes and a lot of challenges in the world right now, but I'm certainly a believer in enabling our youth and my kids. I've got a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old to be able to address new problems and possibly the problems we still have today in the future. And education is key to that. And so certainly generally I'm very into, I'm very strong advocate for companies or organizations that are trying to drive improved education within the youth, whether it be within inner cities or any demographic, but especially those that are taking the approach of how do we teach these kids how to solve problems in a creative way, I think is extremely important. And there's one out in Vancouver that I like to support, but any organization like that, I'm all in. I'm excited to see the results of the efforts of these companies in the future, because I feel like our generation is we need the next generation to step up here.
Yeah, and you know what? If you think about what's happening as we're currently maneuvering around this coronavirus crisis, what we're seeing is creative problem solving like never before. And if we can teach our young kids how to do that when they have a crisis of any kind of nature, it will just come naturally to them to be creative problem solvers. So That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Tony, you have anything else?
No, this has been a fantastic conversation. So I am questioned out. I could probably keep going for another hour or two, but this is good.
You know, I was thinking the same thing. I was kind of watching our time a little bit and I was like, man, that went fast. We could talk about this stuff for days. But Ross, thank you so much. Really great insights. I feel like our audience is going to get so much value from this conversation and really looking at this strategically and at a very high level, how all of these pieces and parts need to fit together. So thank you so much for your time and your willingness to share your expertise. Really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. You both, Betsy and Tony, do a great job with this, and I get a lot of insight from it. So looking forward to hearing all the future episodes.
Well, thanks, Ross. One quick question. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, of course. Just search for Ross Fulton, and I think there's only a few of us on there. I'm at Ross G.D. Fulton on Twitter as well. If anyone wants to reach out and just email me with a question or wants to chat about any of this, always happy to. I'm ross.fulton@valuize.co. Website for Valuize is valuize.co. You can contact me or any of my team through that as well. And we have a lot of content on there which talks to a lot of what we've talked about today if anyone's interested.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Ross.
My pleasure.
That was fantastic. I am still overwhelmed with such information that was provided that Ross gave us here. I think the biggest piece that stands out to me is the depth of knowing your customer. And if you know your customer, you understand who your ideal customer is. And that's not determined by who's going to buy, as Ross very clearly laid out. It's determined by who can be successful achieving the outcomes that they want to achieve with the product or service that you offer. And I think that is something that is not just for technology companies or software companies. That should be across the board. And I know I've been saying it for years, talking to people, my term was your best customer. It's the customer who buys and pays the most and actually is successful achieving their outcomes with your product. And that doesn't matter what industry it's in. So I absolutely love this interview. I mean, I could go on for at least an hour talking about what I loved about it.
Yeah, same here. And, to your point, one of the lines that really caught me that he said is that value is in the eye of the beholder, not the seller.
I wrote that one down too.
Was so good. Yeah, I know. I saw you writing that down. I just think that he has such a unique ability to paint the strategic vision, but then drill down into what that means in day-to-day life for customer success professionals, for CEOs, for product people, whatever the case may be. And I do think this interview really points to the fact that knowing your customer is not just a nice to have and,
right,
wow, we've got a great relationship. It goes so much deeper than that. And, you and I study this stuff on a daily basis and work with clients on this. But man, I learned a lot from talking to Ross.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to see the depth that he goes to. I'm going to come back to this because I really think it can be applied in any industry. And if you're listening to this right now, or you're watching this and you're saying, gosh, I like what Ross said, but I don't know how it applies to my industry, reach out to Betsy and myself, because I guarantee, if we get on a call together, we'll be able to help you apply it to your industry because of the number of industries that we have both covered. I know I've probably touched over 50 different industries doing this type of work that I do. And you've probably got a close to a similar number, I would guess.
Right. Yeah. And it is so important to talk to people, to get different perspectives. And so listening to Ross, having a conversation with you or with me, and especially because he touched on both the areas, the customer experience, right, and how important that is, and then the customer advisory boards and how important that is. And so, yes, listeners, if you want to just have a conversation about this, just pick up the phone, give us a call. We're happy to talk more in depth about that. So in the meantime, we will see you next time on the Really Know Your Customer podcast. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Really Know Your Customer. We hope you gained a lot of value from being here today. If you want to learn more about the work Betsy and Tony do to help their clients thrive, visit Betsy at thecongruitygroup.com and Tony at tonybodoh.com. See you next time on the Really Know Your Customer show.